Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for a webinar of the Institute for Independent Journalists. We'll just take a second to let everyone join the Zoom room. Welcome, everyone. To answer the question I just saw, please do not record this. We are recording this webinar and we will send it out on the IIJ newsletter so your coworkers and colleagues can see it there. But thanks for asking permission. We really appreciate that. Welcome, everyone. If you would like closed captioning, there is a button at the bottom of your screen where you can turn on captions. And especially with this topic, please remember to think about impact as well as intention when you're using the chat, when you're sharing things with each other or the panelists. If you have questions for our panelists, please put them into the Q&A box, not the chat, and we will get to them towards the end of this webinar. And as always, please feel free to share about the Institute for Independent Journalists on social media. Use the hashtag the IIJ, and we always appreciate our panelists' wise words and flattering screenshots and photos being shared as a resource for other folks who maybe aren't able to join us live. Welcome, everyone. I am Catherine Reynolds Lewis. I'm the founder of the Institute for Independent Journalists, whose mission is the financial and emotional sustainability of freelance journalists of color. And everyone is welcome. We're really glad to have you all here. This session, I'm so grateful to our panelists and our moderator for tackling a difficult but really important topic of trauma-informed journalism. And as you might imagine, we're going to be talking about trauma, gender-based violence, rape, mass shooting, other difficult topics. And we want everyone who's attending to be mindful of your own needs and reactions over the course of the next hour and 15 minutes. Please step away if you need to take a moment to recenter yourself or find your balance. This will be recorded. You can always come back to the recording when it goes out on Tuesday in our newsletter. And if any panelist plans to discuss a potentially triggering topic in any great detail, she'll just mention beforehand that people might want to mute themselves or step away for a moment if you think it might be challenging for you. And of course, a disclaimer that nobody here is a licensed therapist or mental health professional. We'll put some resources for support in the chat, and please do take the moment afterwards to explore any resources that do resonate with you. With no further ado, I'm so grateful and excited to introduce our moderator, Leslie Rangel, an Emmy Award nominated journalist and mental wellness coach, wonderful colleague and friend of the IIJ. After a breakdown minutes before going on live TV herself for a report in 2015, Leslie started putting her own mental health first, and she's now on a mission to teach other journalists to build resourcing tools to manage stress in news. Leslie's presented for journalism organizations including RTNDA, IRE, and ONA, and her Yoga for Journalists work has been published in Yoga Journal and the Journalism Institute National Press Club. Leslie, thank you so much for helping us to guide us through this conversation. And thanks again to all the moderators. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I want to welcome you, and of course, just taking a moment here to just take a deep breath. If that feels nice for you, really just allowing yourself to be present in this moment. We're going to hear from some incredible panelists here to discuss and really help normalize this conversation of mental wellness in news. So I appreciate you all being here. I'm going to open up with a quote, and this is from Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry's book, What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. And so the quote goes like this: "So I'm not crazy? No, Your brain is doing exactly what you would expect it to do, considering what you've lived through. So just taking a moment to really take that in. As Catherine mentioned, there have been times in my career where I have wondered that very question, and the way our body responds is simply, again, how you'd expect it to, considering what we've all lived through. And then, just as a standard definition, before we continue talking about some more of these topics, trauma in its most basic form is defined as something that your body, your mind doesn't know how to react to. So basically, those instances where we don't feel safe. All right, so let's introduce our panelists. Lisa Armstrong is an award-winning journalist with credits in the Texas Tribune, the New Yorker, The Intercept, Rolling Stone, and other outlets. She's currently reporting on incarceration and has written about the spread of COVID-19 in correctional facilities and young people who were sentenced to life without parole as minors. She's also produced a documentary for CBS News about how subpar mental health care provided by for-profit companies led to an increase in suicides in state prisons. She also directed a documentary about a young man who was incarcerated in an adult prison when he was just 16 years old. The film Little Lost Boy was featured in the Social Impact track at South by Southwest here in Austin, Texas. I'm based in Austin. She's a professor at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism and a trainer with the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. Lisa, thanks for joining us. We'd like to welcome you. You could just wave. All right. And then we have Naseem Miller. She is the senior health editor at the Journalist Resource. Hi, Naseem. Before joining JR, she was a senior health reporter at the Orlando Centennial, where she covered the Pulse nightclub mass shooting. She was part of that team. That was a 2016 Pulitzer Prize finalist for its coverage of that tragedy. In 2017, she co-started the Journalists Covering Trauma Facebook group as an information resource about journalist mental health and, of course, the responsible reporting of tragedies. Thank you so much, Naseem, for being here. Then Amrita Doshi is co-founder and the executive director of South Asian SOAR, a national organization dedicated to ending gender-based violence in the US-based South Asian diaspora. She is deeply committed to advancing healing and justice for South Asian survivors and communities. Amrita comes to this work with her expertise and her experiences of survivorship, as well as several years of work across public health, technology, and art. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so as we continue in this very important conversation, I would love to hear from the panelists. Could each of you share a little bit more about your background, your career, and how you really came into the topic of trauma-informed journalism? And Lisa, I'll start with you.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having me. So as Leslie mentioned, I mainly cover incarceration, and before that spent 4 years reporting in Haiti after the earthquake, and I was reporting mainly on sexual assault as well as HIV/AIDS and how people were living with it after the earthquake. And most of my career, I have focused on things that have involved trauma. So I've been talking to people who have had traumatic events. And I didn't really think much about it when I was in journalism school. We didn't have conversations about trauma or how to talk to people who'd experienced trauma or even how to deal with trauma ourselves. And so it wasn't something that I thought about in doing the work. I acknowledged, obviously, in talking with people, trying to do so in a sensitive way and trying to treat them in the way that I would want to be treated in their shoes. But I didn't think about the impact of doing this work on myself. I'm going to share a brief story about something that did happen that made me start thinking about it. One of the last stories that I did in Haiti was about girls who had been sexually assaulted. And I spent about 5 hours in a room talking to girl after girl after girl. And when I got back to New York, which is where I was living at the time, I wasn't really able to work. I couldn't look at my notes. I couldn't listen to the interviews, and I couldn't do anything. And even then, I didn't really acknowledge that maybe the stories and having heard these stories over several years, I didn't acknowledge that maybe that had had an impact on me. I watched really bad reality TV as a way to escape. And it wasn't until I had a Dart Center fellowship where I learned about trauma and the impact that these stories can have on journalists. Like that was the first time that I actually had heard anyone talk about these things. And since then, I've been doing a lot of work with the Dart Center, either as a fellow, so I've had a couple of fellowships that they offer, and then started working with them as a trainer. But really, as I said, that was the first time that I'd thought about this. As a professor, the fellowship that I had was one for educators, and it's something that I then started talking with my students about, because I think it's something that we really need to talk about as journalists.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, so much for that. And I think we can all echo, unfortunately, many of us have started paying attention after something traumatic has happened. Naseem, can you share a little bit about your background, your career, and how you came to be an expertise in trauma-informed journalism?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here, and thanks for focusing on this topic. So I've been a health reporter for most of my, almost all of my career. And, there's some stories that stay with you or change how you approach your work. And of course, for me, was the Pulse nightclub mass shooting here in Orlando about 6 or 7 years ago now. And, at the time, the first few weeks kind of are a blur for me because, we're in this adrenaline rush and you're in this belief that this happened in your backyard. 49 people were killed by a lone gunman, and it was heartbreaking. And it wasn't until a year later that I connected with another reporter who was in Texas and was covering the mass shooting of her own space over there. And we sort of started talking on social media about how we're feeling, how some of the things had stayed with us over time after covering these mass shootings. And we thought maybe we should start a Facebook group to see if other journalists were experiencing what we were experiencing and feeling what we were feeling. So we started this Facebook group, Journalists Covering Trauma, and invited our colleagues first, and little by little it grew. And as a part of having this Facebook group, I, of course, felt the responsibility of sharing information with people as I learned more about how our work could affect our mental health and, how we went about things. And that's how I came across DART, which unfortunately I didn't know about beforehand. And that's where I learned so much about the intersection of trauma and journalism. And of course, the pandemic happened and we all started experiencing stress and higher levels of stress than before. And more people started talking about these issues. And only in the past year or so, I feel like more of us are talking about trauma-informed journalism, which is really practicing journalism with awareness of how trauma can affect survivors, and how when we do our reporting well, with this awareness, not only we can protect our sources, but also we can protect ourselves and our values and our mental well-being. So, and that's kind of what brings me here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It sounds similar in that during our reporting, we come across these incredibly difficult experiences. But what about folks who are survivors? And Amrita, I'd love for you to share a little bit more about that, and specifically your work and how you are tied and connected to those of us in journalism.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for sharing, Lisa and Naseem. So one of the first ways that I entered sort of into this space and thinking about it is that SOAR runs a storytelling program for survivors. And two things sort of stick out to me from that. One is that everyone sort of ended that program saying, I don't have just one story. Like, it is really difficult for me to just share or write or think about one story when I have actually a lifetime of survivorship that I'm reflecting on. And I think that was so powerful for me, because often when we're reporting or you're seeing a piece, it's one story or one incident, and maybe doesn't really reflect the totality of what survivorship looks like over a lifetime. And the second thing that jumps out to me, sorry, is that 50% of the participants in that program are service providers, which means their day-to-day is providing supportive services to other survivors. And I think what sticks out to me there is just that survivorship is across everyone. It's across survivors, their families, the people who are working with survivors, and then likely journalists themselves. And so how do we then hold a space that is trauma-informed and healing-centered for everyone involved in that process? And then lastly, just personally, before running SOAR and like still to this day, I'm a dancer, and dance and art are rooted in storytelling. And that was my medium for telling my own story. And I realized how much that story has changed when it was difficult and when it was easy to work on it, and the mediums that I actually found a lot of joy sharing in versus the mediums that I didn't. And just it, I think, drives me to want to provide and find spaces for all of those ways for a story to come out and live.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said. Thank you so much for sharing. I think that as humans, we forget that our body is so integral in how we're feeling and how we're showing up in this space. So thank you so much for sharing that. Lisa, you talked about not really knowing yet what trauma-informed journalism was, or really how trauma impacts a journalist on the day-to-day experience until you went through this experience, and then you found DART. Can you explain to us here, as we're all meeting today, how trauma from your professional lens impacts journalists in the day-to-day experience of as we are doing our work, and what is really trauma-informed journalism? I know you said now you're a trainer with DART.
So I want to start by talking a little bit about how trauma impacts people, just period. And the way that Bruce Shapiro, who's the executive director of the DART Center, explains is that imagine that you are in like a minor car accident, so a fender bender where your car might be dinged up, maybe you're shaken, but you know you're not seriously injured. In that moment, you know your brain, like the brainstem, goes into fight, flight, freeze, and there are these hormones, and this is basically like a stress response. You're put in survival mode, but probably when you get home and you talk to someone about it, or later that evening, your stress response is going to go down, so you're going to return to normal. But with something that is severely traumatic, or if it's something that's happening over and over again, what happens is that, yes, there's that immediate response, but then there's your limbic system that is responsible for emotions, and it will store whatever that thing is, but it will store it like with your five senses, which is why you'll find if someone has been traumatized by something, of experienced trauma, that the smell of something or the sight of something might trigger a memory. So I want to sort of just use that, and I'm not a scientist, and that's a very sort of cursory view of what happens with trauma. But I think the way that this impacts journalists can be a couple of ways. So one is with repeated exposure. And I think that's how a lot of journalists come to this. It's often not just they cover the one traumatic event. It's journalism is sort of rooted in, we unfortunately are the ones who show up when something bad is happening more often than not. And we're doing it over and over and over and over again so that it takes its toll. I actually would be interested in hearing from Naseem just sort of how having the big event, like the big traumatic event, how that impacts versus these little drips of trauma over time. But trauma-informed reporting is one, taking into consideration how trauma impacts the people that you might be interviewing. So understanding that people who have been traumatized might forget things, or they might be hypervigilant, or they might be angry about things that you think they shouldn't be angry about, or they might tell stories in ways that you might not expect them to. So for instance, when I was doing a lot of reporting in Haiti, there were times where people will tell me stories, and they might tell me, I was going back over time, and I would see the same people over and over again. And so I might see someone, say in January, and they tell me the story one way, and then in March, they would tell a different story. And again, it wasn't until I got to the Dart Center that I understood that the way that people are remembering things is different than the way that I'm recording this and trying to get a story, but for them, it's like they're remembering things in different ways. So the trauma-informed reporting is one about recognizing how people might be impacted in trauma, recognizing how journalists can create a safe space for those people, but then also how journalists can respond to this themselves. So ways that journalists can set boundaries, because often if you're interviewing someone who's experienced trauma, they can bond with you in a way that, you know, you do have to set boundaries, and we can talk a little bit more about that. Also recognizing your own mental health and figuring out ways to cope. So what are the things that you need to do on a regular basis after an interview that will help you, recognizing the signs that these things might be impacting you. So as I said, in my case, I couldn't work, but you know, trauma impacts people in different ways. So you might not be able to concentrate. You might have physical symptoms of there might be anxiety. So any number of those things, but trauma-informed reporting is, again, both about considering the people that we're interviewing and making sure that we're creating a safe space for them, and then also recognizing what we as journalists should be doing to protect ourselves.
Yeah, that's so great, so important. As we continue in this conversation, Naseem, from your perspective, what do you wish you had known before you covered something like the Pulse shooting? And Lisa touched on it a little bit, but how can we leave our sources in a better position than when we interviewed them?
Yeah, really, it boils down to knowing and understanding how trauma could affect people, especially in those first days after these tragedies happen. People have various reactions, are feeling all sorts of feelings. And when you approach people, I think it empowers journalists when they know why somebody might be very angry or shut down or react the way they react that we usually don't encounter in our everyday interviews as reporters. So that knowledge, I think, is very helpful, because approaching people after these tragedies is never going to be easy. But having information is helpful. So, and one of the things Lisa mentioned, that now she's talking to her students, I think it's very important, and hopefully more journalism programs are going to start talking about trauma-informed reporting to students. So when they enter the field, they know what they could encounter. And, you know, it doesn't have to be these awful tragedies that become national news. These little by little small trickles add up, as Lisa mentioned. And, you know, we usually put young reporters in the breaking news desk where the most difficult stories come in. So, and as far as how to leave our sources in a better position, really, it boils down to how we conduct the interviews, how we practice this trauma-informed journalism that we call, which is all about preparation. Have a plan for before, during, and after. One thing to understand with trauma is people who have been through these tragedies have lost sense of control. Something awful has happened to them where they had no control over. And the one thing you can do as a journalist is give them some control back. And that means some simple things like, where would you like to meet, instead of you choosing that place? Is it okay for me to ask you this difficult question during that interview? Bruce Shapiro mentioned a journalist that before their interview start, she asked along with the source, to take 3 deep breaths to put everything, you know, in calm position, because it's not easy to have somebody walk through what they have been through. So there are very simple steps you can take to put your sources at a good space, to not cause undue stress on them, and put humans before your story in these difficult cases. Because when you're talking to survivors of tragic events, it's completely different from when you're holding powerful people accountable or doing your everyday interviews. Another thing we talk about, these stories that will help you in the long run when you're talking to survivors, is err on the side of over-explaining. Explain who you are, what you do, where the story is going to appear. What are some of the terms that we are familiar with, like on the record, off the record, on background? You remember, these are average citizens who might never have dealt with journalists before. So take the time to explain things before jumping in and putting a mic in front of somebody. And at the end, there are little things you can do. Just change the topic real quick as to like, what are you going to do next today? Like, the weather is nice, like something different, and make sure if they're not in a good headspace that they have somebody hopefully to be with them. Don't, pack up and leave. So again, these are extra measures that you can take when it comes to interviewing survivors, especially for difficult stories. One of the things I'll drop in as soon as I'm done talking is Dart Center has a great style guide for trauma-informed reporting. And I really recommend that you guys bookmark it, read through the descriptions. It has a lot of great information about different terms that we use every day, including the term trauma. And it really encourages us to use that term judiciously and not, every day, of course, is fine when we're talking about, oh, I'm so traumatized by this and that. But when we're talking about stories and survivors, it's very important to understand these terminologies and know when to use them.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Naseem. I resonate really with the part that you said, they're humans first. That's something that as a mental wellness coach, I always say to my students, humans first, journalists second, but I love how you put it in the perspective of humans first and then sources. That's beautiful. And who better to be able to give more perspective on that than Amrita. If you could share with us, what is the best way for journalists to interact with survivors? Specifically, how can we do better when we show up? Naseem said, take deep breaths. I like this aspect, helping to regulate the nervous system. But what other steps? What more can we do to really help reduce harm to folks and communities experiencing violence?
Thank you. And yeah, as I was reflecting on this question, I mean, Naseem really captured it. I was thinking, so often the thing we talk about is that experiencing gender-based violence is experiencing a loss of autonomy over your decision-making, over your body, over your rights. And what you can do as a journalist is to restore that autonomy or control, which means supporting the survivor to show up how they want to show up, to be identified how they want to identify. Do they want to use a pseudonym? Do they want to use, not use their photo, use their photo? Can you share back what they said as they were speaking through something and like confirm that you got it right? And you're respecting the way that they phrase something, not like over editing their story into some sort of framework that you want. So I think all of those are opportunities to support and let them know that their autonomy is the most important. And I think that's like a very transformative, supportive experience for someone who may not even be sure that they have autonomy in that space. And you have a role in affirming that. Another thing that I really like, because we've talked about the impact of trauma on memory or on just retelling those incidents, is not to maybe prescribe a chronological sort of retelling in an interview, but really allow a survivor to start wherever they want to start and then work your way to piece together that story. And that is something that can be a collaborative process. But oftentimes, like, someone may not start at the most traumatic point or at the point that you want them to start, and they might actually want to start somewhere else while they build trust with you. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more later about the actual setting and things you can do. But one thing I wanted to sort of tack on to what Naseem said, which was about, how can you maybe like ask what someone's doing that day or later that day, or what they might be doing to sort of take space for themselves after the interview, is even at the beginning of the interview, can you bake in some space just to build rapport, build trust in that moment, be casual, and really ease someone's maybe sense of anxiety that one of us would probably walk into any sort of interview space with. So those are some recommendations.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate you saying that. And this is also something that I share with my students is how can we show up as humans to really listen and be there for our community if we're not showing up and listening to ourselves as humans, kind of turning the lens on that. So in the spirit of that question, Lisa, I'd love to ask you, what steps can journalists take to prevent or reduce the impact of trauma on ourselves? What is self-care? What does that mean? Oh, I believe you're still muted, Lisa. Just wanted to make sure we didn't miss any of that.
After all these years on Zoom. So I think one of the first things is knowing your signs. So knowing, just how things impact you and then how that shows up for you. Pacing yourself. So making sure that you are not, especially this is something that you're covering over months, years, that you're kind of regulating your trauma load so that, you know when it's been too much for you. Part of it is like any sort of self-care, like staying grounded, breathing, exercising, meditation, having relationships with people. So one of the things that I started doing kind of organically, and it started in Haiti. I had a reporting partner in Haiti, but I would do these interviews and then just offload. And my offloading took a number of different forms. It either I will write things after, and it's not my notes, but just sort of like how I'm feeling or what I've experienced. If you're a friend or family member, the dangers that I will offload on you. So I would often call like my mother after an interview and say, here's what I heard. But just having people around who can listen to you, a therapist helps. But for me, it's just in the moment being able to get those things out, because as I'm doing the interview, I'm often in this mode where I am listening and I'm empathetic and I'm paying attention, but I'm not fully processing what I'm hearing, because if I fully processed some of what I heard during interviews, like I probably wouldn't be able to continue. So there's a process afterwards. But I think it's really, again, understanding it's an individual thing. It's understanding what impacts you, how much you can take, how those things show up for you, and then figuring out methods to cope, and then having that as part of almost like a toolkit. So knowing that, all right, I'm going to do this interview, or I'm going to cover these things, and this is how I need to take care of myself. I think the other thing, and it's, that's been talked about, is also just the things that you do both for yourself and for the person you're interviewing. And so it's around explaining exactly what you're going to be doing, how long it's going to take, how long you're going to be in this person's life, what that's going to look like, and then setting certain boundaries. So for me, boundary setting has been really important, particularly with the folks in prison, because I'm often the only person with whom they're interacting in the free world, because they're people I know who, at the time that I met them, they'd been incarcerated for like 40 something years. And so had lost contact with a lot of people. So I find that I often get people asking for things or saying things that cross a line, and I then have to sort of remind them that this is the boundary. And the boundary setting exists both for you as the journalist in terms of maintaining your space, but also for the other person, because I think boundary setting helps both parties. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that perspective, Lisa. And talking, about the flip side of that coin, so to speak, Amrita, what should we as journalists know about coming into a space with survivors, with relationship? I know Lisa mentioned coverage specifically with those who are incarcerated, but what other things should we keep in mind? And even going as far as to, I know you alluded to it earlier, but the environment, the setting of an interview. Lisa mentioned some of those boundaries. What are some things to ask or avoid?
Yeah. So because I work sort of on the side where I'm supporting journalists to cover a case or maybe connecting them to a survivor, to interview, I think one of the things that I would recommend is like check in with me on your list of questions. And not just me, like the advocates that you might be working with, because often you're connected to a nonprofit that might be connecting you to the survivor or is working with their family. And I think that's always a good checkpoint. Am I using the language that this individual uses with you? And does it reflect what they're asking to be named or identified as? I specifically, we work with a lot of immigrants, and though a lot of our academic or research work uses the term gender-based violence, that's not necessarily the term we use colloquially to talk about it. I think those are opportunities to match and mirror language within a particular community specifically. So I think that is one way, sort of lean on the relationships that the survivor has or has built trust with to sort of filter and assess the questions and even the framing of them. The second thing for the interview space that I really appreciate and has been put forth in a guide by Witness, which I'll share in the chat, is this idea of a comfort kit for a survivor. So especially if you're doing something in person, you can think about do they need like tissues? Is there some object that makes them feel comfortable that I can ask them to bring with them? Is there a snack that I can offer or ask them to bring with them? And then, of course, is there a person? Is there an advocate, a friend, someone that they trust that maybe is in that space or even just in the environment that they can lean on if they need to? So those are some examples, I think, of like physical things that are during the interview. And then, as I mentioned, what can you do before and after to just check in and really do your research and prep to ensure that you're creating a supportive environment.
Thank you so much for that. This is a question that just comes to mind as we're talking through this, and because Amrita, you mentioned showing questions. I know for me as a journalist, that was something that I for me as a journalist who worked in the TV space, that wasn't something that was often a practice. And so Naseem, this question's for you. You are a Pulitzer Prize winner. How can we ensure, from your expertise, how can we ensure that we are, still sticking to our duty as journalists, but also being fair and not doing more harm to the folks who we're sharing these stories about?
Thank you. And I was a finalist. I'm not a winner, sadly, for Pulitzer.
But you should be a winner.
Thank you. So yeah, it's a difficult balance, but for these stories, again, if we lean back on putting our sources first and their stories first, it will be quite helpful because it helps us stick with our values, because we know a lot of times as journalists, we know what is the right thing to do in difficult situations. So that's one of the important things that we can do. I don't know if there's another angle of your question I can answer, or if you want to ask it again. I want to make sure I cover it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my question was, with your experience in journalism, I know that for some journalists, they might be, they might think twice about having that trust in relationship, as Amrita mentioned, to be able to say, these are my questions. And so really it's just a question about trust and maybe how long did it take you to build that trust and to realize, no, this is something that I need to do, because in the end, it's going to be better both for my source and the overall journalism story.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it with our sources, and these are things I've learned since the mass shooting, is how important it is, as we talked about, not only by creating boundaries, but by explaining how the whole process works. And that explanation with sources, and I'm hoping like Amrita can add to this too, because I'm always curious about the experience of survivors, how explaining how the process of journalism works, and where there is eventually going to be a story and there is eventually going to be an end to this interaction. And I think explaining all this ahead of time will help both sides to be prepared. Like even with the interview, explaining to the source that, okay, we are coming to the end of the interview. I have one more question for you. And after your question, is there anything else you would like to add? So your survivor doesn't feel like, okay, I'm done, I'm gone, goodbye, as if, you took what you needed and you're gone. So I think clear communication is the best thing we can do. And I know a lot of times as journalists, we don't do that with a lot of sources, because if our sources are politicians, but people in power, people in the media, I don't know, entertainers, they already know how this process works. So we don't take the time to explain that to a hospital CEO, because we know they know what the process is. But we have to remember these are not only, average citizens, but also somebody, they have suffered major psychological injury. And we don't know as regular reporters what part of healing process they might be in. So it's always tread with caution and with explanation and with respect. I don't know, Amrita, I would love to hear, and Lisa, I guess you want to add something. But
yeah, I just wanted to add something to that about the relationship with the source. I think checking in on them. So I actually have a thing that I'm in contact with people after the story is done. And I will check in on people, even in the course of my work often takes months to complete. And in that time, I'm often talking to people not about the story, but just about them. Because Amrita mentioned, we're there for this blip in their life, this thing that happened, but they have a whole life outside of this thing. And so I try to connect with people just on, going and spending time with them. If I'm, in Haiti, I would sometimes just go and be there hanging out, and I'm not necessarily interviewing. I will call people to check in on them. Even after the story is done, I'm in contact with people in Haiti, and I haven't reported there in several years. And I'm not in contact with every single person, and it's impossible as a journalist to maintain contact with every single person. And I agree, I will say to them, okay, this is now the story's out. I show it to them. I make sure they're okay with it. But the relationship is not just about me being a journalist and them being a source. The relationship is about me being a person and them being a person, and us connecting on that level as well. And I think that really helps in terms of building trust.
Yeah, thank you both. That is exactly what I was searching for in that answer, which leads me straight into my next question for Amrita. As we're showing up in these spaces, what would you like to see the media do better in how we report on these incidents? As Lisa said, we're just there for a blip and then we continue. But some of these stories that we're doing could lead to huge headlines. Oftentimes, they grow and grow and grow. Often it could lead to sensational headlines. And how does that impact the advocacy work that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I'm still reflecting this theme on your question, so I'll try to bring it into this. I feel like I can point to the violence that we're all seeing in the past several years. And I think one thing that's really coming up for us, sort of on the end of being interviewed and participating in the reporting of incidents, is what is sort of the overall goal of this piece? What is the story being told, and what is it advocating for? So for example, I think we would love to see folks work with nonprofit or community-based groups or organizations to understand what does this community want? Are they calling for more police, for example? Are they calling for more community-based solutions? What sort of change do they want to come about from this incident? Also, again, coming from an immigrant, ethnic community, thinking about, is this violence unique to them? And am I going to continue perpetuating exoticized tropes of how violence might exist in a South Asian, Black, or Brown community? Or can I support contextualizing this in how violence happens in every community? So I think really checking in about what that narrative is and where you might be falling on tropes or agendas that actually don't match how that community speaks of and perceives their own violence. So I think that sort of checkpoint on the overall narrative and overall goal is really important. And then to the sensationalization, again, kind of, we're coming off of a year of seeing a lot of deaths due to gender-based violence. And I think on the advocate side, really realizing that folks hold so much more grief seeing those sensationalized reports, and they're re-traumatized. And when we checked in to say, what do you need from seeing this number and this toll increase? They said, we need to slow down, we need to pause, we need to make space to acknowledge, and we need to make space to honor the lives that we've lost. And I think that is something that I would love to message out, which is especially in cases where we've lost lives, really thinking about, again, like that life, that personhood that individual held, the family that they leave behind, and trying to bring more to that piece than just the incident and maybe the fallout of that. So those are kind of my two key things there.
Yeah, thank you so much. With that, and feel free, Naseem, Amrita, and Lisa, to share your perspective on this. But when we are going into these situations, Amrita, like you mentioned, and we're interviewing and we're doing the fact-checking portion of this, as Lisa mentioned, sometimes survivors remember things in different ways depending on how they've gone through a certain situation. What are some important things to bear in mind after it's done and we are crafting the piece? And Amrita, I'll let you answer first.
Yeah, I think I'll just be brief here because I was reflecting on this and the fact that I actually think that we've been able to sort of build relationships with journalists who haven't asked for that. And I think just like a couple of checkpoints for yourself. Is this necessary? Why am I asking? And what harm could it cause if I am going to go through with this process? And I think informed consent has been brought up, really informing the person that you're interviewing that process is going to take place and why it needs to take place. So I think transparency, checking in with yourself, and really just confirming that it needs to happen, I think are three things one could do.
Beautiful. And for clarification, when you say process, you mean fact checking?
Yeah, fact checking process.
Okay, great. Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, so fact checking is just a part of the journalistic process. So everything that I'm writing or reporting, I have to make sure that to the best of my ability, I have shown that these things are true. And one of the things that happened when I was reporting in Haiti, there was a young woman who was working as a sex worker because she said initially the story she told me, she'd lost her parents during the earthquake. She'd been living in a camp. In the first few months after the earthquake, there was food being distributed by the World Food Program, and then they stopped. And so she was doing sex work in order to support herself. And I discovered at a certain point that she actually wasn't telling me the truth about certain things, like both her parents had not died in the earthquake. One had died before. And in talking to her about it and saying, like your story as is, like it's what happened to you is horrible. And so, why did you make this part of the story up? And she'd explained to me that some other people had told her that people from Europe were coming and they were paying people for their stories. And so they told her, if you tell like the sadder the story, the more money you're going to get. And so I'd had to explain to her that in the US, I can't pay you for stories, like that's considered unethical. And that's something I think we can talk about because I think there's a question about that. But I explain to people what I'm doing. And I think we've talked about this. And so the fact checking part of this might be, in Haiti, there weren't often police reports, but maybe the person went to the hospital or they told someone or there's something. And it came from me sort of first building trust. Like, I don't know that I would have been able to go in, do a story about something this traumatic and then say, okay, hey, I have to fact check this now. Like that wouldn't have worked. Anytime that I did a story, I'd known these people for months. And so I would explain to them, it's not that I don't believe you. It's just that for me to produce this story, and often my stories are fact checked by someone else. So I do a lot of long form magazine pieces, and the publication has its own fact checkers, and they're going to want to know, well, did you check this? And so it's about explaining, it's not that I don't believe you, it's that just this is the process for my story, and I have to make sure that whatever I'm putting in here is correct. And the same thing has happened to me with someone who's incarcerated, who again told me he fudged a certain part of the story, and in looking through court records and talking with other people, I discovered that, and I explained the same thing to him. Hey, this part of your story doesn't seem like it's quite accurate. He did get upset because he was basically trying to show that he was innocent, and in a sense he is, but I think it really is about explaining the process and explaining why it is that we're doing what we're doing. And I think that the fact checking can involve, you can involve people. So I was trained as a journalist. You don't show anyone your story before it's published. Like, that's kind of a journalism rule. And there are instances in which I have shown people the entire story to say, you know, are you okay with this? This is what I found in the fact checking process. So actually working with the other person to make sure that they are comfortable before that story runs.
Yeah, thank you so much. Naseem, is there anything you'd like to add on that?
I mean, no, what they both, Lisa and Amrita, captured it. It's just all boils down to informed consent and you taking a moment before jumping into the, especially sit down interviews that are longer, to explain everything to your sources. So just put that on your checklist before you start.
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, our conversation has centered a lot around what we can do as individual journalists, whether we're working for a company or freelance or freelancing for a company. Naseem, what do you see as the responsibility of news managers and leaders in protecting journalists and really shifting the culture to reduce the impact of covering violence?
Yeah, you know, one of the silver linings of the pandemic has been, you know, a lot more of us as journalists are talking about mental health, and everything else that we have been through in the past few years has brought this issue to the forefront. And, you know, I feel like in the 2020 and 2021, there was a lot of talk about self-care, and self-care is very important. Please exercise, eat well, drink water. These are just simple little things. And Dr. Alana Newman at Dart Center always mentions it, about these simple, take breaks, get up from your desk. If you do hard stories, take longer breaks. These are very important things, and be intentional about them because they help build your resilience and help you cope with stress. But one of the thing is, you can do so much self-care, but if you're in an organization that doesn't look after you, you know, there is a limit to what you can do for your own mental health and well-being. And I'm really glad to see in the past year, there's more discussion about the responsibility of news managers and newsrooms and news organizations in looking after journalists and normalizing conversations about mental health so that a journalist doesn't feel conflicted about going to their manager and saying, this has been a difficult story, I need a break afterward, and don't feel like they're going to be penalized because they are sharing that information with their manager. We have to understand we are all human, we need breaks, and there are just, feels like there are more and more tragedies we are covering as journalists and coming across as journalists. So people need breaks, and so there are more news managers kind of understanding this, and we are hoping, and I'm hoping that there will more conversations come into the newsrooms. But, you know, I've been thinking about freelancers, and I still think there's a huge gap between what newsrooms do for their journalists and what they do for freelancers. And, you know, freelancers play such an important role, not only for domestic journalism, but also international journalism. They cover difficult stories. You know, in overseas, we have people who are called fixers, who are local journalists who help international journalists do their work. And newsrooms need to have, I mean, I think they have a responsibility to stay in touch, not only look after these journalists' physical safety, but also emotional safety. So I'm really happy to see organizations like IIJ, you know, that are standing behind freelancers. There's also ACOS Alliance. I'll drop a link in there after I'm done talking, where they are looking after creating a culture of safety for freelancers. So really, I'm hoping that these organizations elevate the conversations and bring this to the forefront, because I know for a freelance journalist, it's probably very difficult to tell news managers, so how are you going to look after me? Because it's a contract, it's one story. It's difficult for one journalist to stand to a news organization. But if there are organizational movements to propel news organizations to look after freelancers, especially, I'm hopeful there will be a change. And in the meantime, please remember that self-care actually matters. So it's not just some woo-woo stuff, but exercising and looking after yourself and taking breaks does make a difference. So do what makes you feel good. Find a hobby, go running if that's your thing, meditate, take deep breaths, and get up from your desk as often as you can.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's regulating the nervous system. I love that. Well, I do want to make sure that we leave time for Q&A. We do have some questions, but I will say, is there any final thoughts that I didn't ask that you feel is important to add for all of you before we move into the questions? And if not, we'll dive right in. Okay. All right. The first question says, I would love to know the panelists' key tips for gaining consent and trust from survivors, and in ways especially that are explicit as possible and within their truth and capacity, by minimizing triggering our sources. And whoever wants to hop in to tackle that question. Do I need to call on you?
I'm happy to share one that comes sort of like off the top of my mind, and I think relates to one of the other Q&A questions is, I actually think providing things written is extremely helpful. I think one thing that's very tough is like only verbally saying a bunch of consent related information is a lot to process, especially at the top of an interview, especially when you're going into a really heavy subject matter. So I think that's one really one really great way that you can build trust and offer that, information in a supportive way, and give someone the time to actually review it and consent to it and ask questions as well. I think letting them know, like, you can advocate for yourself and you have the agency to ask me about what's in this. I think often it feels like there's a very strong power dynamic in those spaces and you kind of have to follow the rules. And you, like someone on the other, being interviewed may not know they actually have the agency to, ask more. I feel like it's like kind of being in a doctor's office and not knowing you're allowed to ask what your doctor is like telling you or prescribing you.
Thank you so much, Amrita. The second question, I think, Lisa, you might be great for this, since you hinted at this earlier, but this question says, I've had sources ask for compensation in exchange, talking about the traumatic situations. How do you handle such requests?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, again, journalism ethics dictate that we are not supposed to give money to our sources. The way that I look at this is just sort of, I need to be able to sleep at night. This is sort of the way that I think about this work, is that whatever I've done, whatever my interaction with this person, like, I have to be able to sleep at night knowing that I did the right thing. And so in instances, sometimes people haven't asked me, but I've recognized, so for instance, the young woman that I mentioned who was working as a sex worker, when I'd gone back to do some reporting, it had rained 3 nights in a row. So she was not able to go out and work. She had no food. She explained that to me. I did the interview with her over lunch, and I simply said, oh, like, this is the time that I have free. Can you come, here, and let's eat together. There have been instances where I won't pay someone for an interview directly, because the reason being is that if it becomes, I'm paying you for the story, then I feel like there is the chance that the person might embellish it, or they might do something they wouldn't ordinarily do if money weren't a part of that process. But there are instances where I have helped people after the fact. I haven't gone in and said to them, I'm paying you for your story. It's either been, these are people who I might pay for their kids to go to school afterwards, just because that's the kind of relationship that I built with them. Or there are instances where I will try to provide resources for people. So as a general rule, I'm not giving people money for an interview. And if someone said to me, you need to pay me for this interview, I would explain to them that no, then I can't do the interview. That ethically, I cannot do that. And so if they don't want to talk with me, that's fine. And I have had to explain that. But I do think as journalists, we need to think about the fact that when we're talking to people, one, we are profiting off of their stories. So when I'm doing a story, someone's paying me for this story, and the money isn't necessarily coming back to the person who has told their story to me. So they're sort of telling me their story, and they're in the same situation they were in before. Maybe something changes for them, maybe it doesn't. But I think we do need to think about the fact that we're taking people's time. People might not be able to work during the time that they're talking to us. So they might be, if they're paid on an hourly basis, they might be losing money. So I think just thinking about the circumstances of the interview and what that person might be losing in talking to you, and finding ways, even if it's just pointing people to resources that might be helpful to them. I think that we as journalists kind of do need to think more about sort of, the ethics around this and what is right.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Naseem, I'll direct this question to you since you really spoke about holding news managers accountable. The question is, how can I advocate in the newsroom for following your recommendations when we're always on deadline and there doesn't seem to be a lot of support?
Sure. First, I wanted to answer the first question you asked about gaining trust of the survivors. The one thing I also want to mention is take no for an answer when you approach somebody for an interview and they don't want to talk to you, and leave them your card and tell them, I'm always available if you ever decide to talk to me. And again, this is understanding that they may not be ready to talk to you at that moment, but they might reach out to you later. So, speaking about minimizing triggering sources, do not force your sources to walk through feelings, emotions, and memories that they don't feel comfortable walking through. Please remember that and take no for an answer. So that's one. Number two, about newsrooms. It is difficult, I understand. It's easier said than done a lot of times. But one of the things one thing I learned recently about some of the journalists in Canada who are also focusing on this space is sometimes maybe if you're in a newsroom, a simple survey could help you build backup for what you think is needed in the newsroom. I mean, we have Google Forms now. You can create that simply and spread it among your colleagues and ask about maybe burnout, what kind of mental health needs they may need, whether they need breaks, whether they're feeling undue stress, and things like. And when you collect this information in the surveys, you can show it to your manager and say, well, this is seems to be a sentiment in the newsroom. What can we do about it? So, and I think that in that way, especially when it's an anonymous survey, you're kind of expressing the voice of the newsroom without pointing any fingers to anybody. But I hope you're a space where your managers are going to be understanding and receptive at this. And I understand there are also spaces where managers aren't, and I'm sorry if you're in that situation. I don't know if there's a good answer for that, and it's very unfortunate.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That's a great idea on the anonymous survey. We'll move on for the sake of time. Amrita, the next question is for you. Are there red flags when you're approached by a journalist that tell you that person may not be prepared to interview a survivor with appropriate care, and how have you handled that?
Yeah, I think that relates a lot to my answer to the first question. So I think, for example, if someone is demonstrating that they won't use the language that we're offering, if they won't make the accommodations that we're asking for, if they refuse to share questions, if they're not transparent about the timeline of the story of, will quotes be shared, will they not be shared, when will they be shared? I think these are sort of moments where we pick up red flags. And to be honest, and I think another thing that's a very honest process and that's happened is providing feedback after a piece has come out. And how does that journalist respond to feedback? And I think that's like a telling moment around, do we want to work with them in the future or not? And with regards to how we handle that, just full transparency, like our organization is very new. I don't think that I've handled this to the, I don't know, enough times to sort of like know how I would do this, but I also operate with the mindset of abundance. And I don't feel bad saying no to someone about a story because I know that someone else will cover it with a trauma-informed lens and approach. And I would much rather prefer that than be covered in media and not have a good experience for myself or a survivor that we're referring them to.
Yeah, thank you so much. We've got about 5 minutes left for this last question. Lisa and Naseem, have you ever encountered trauma survivors who shared details that were extreme or ugly or painted them in a bad light and you thought twice about sharing them? So it goes on to say, I don't want to infantilize my sources, but I do sometimes wonder if trauma makes it hard to make calls about what to share, what not to share. I sometimes worry about trolls and other horrible people who will comment, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's part of what happens, especially if someone has experienced trauma and they haven't really had a chance to talk about it. So often people will talk to me and they'll say, oh, I feel better because it's almost like it's therapy. I got to talk about this thing and you listened to me. And sometimes people do say things. And as Naseem said, like, these are people who are maybe not used to dealing with journalists. And so I go back to, saying, okay, I'm writing this story. Are you okay with this being published? Are you, I would say, this is how many people might read this story. If it's something that's online, this is going to last forever. Are you okay with this? And that then is giving that person an opportunity to say, no, I want this out there. So there's a story, generally in media, we would not use the names of people who have been sexually assaulted. And so that was sort of the framework that I was using and working in Haiti. And there was an instance where there was a woman who's like, no, you can use my name, use my picture. And I said, well, this is the circulation of the magazine and it's going to live forever. And And I explained all this stuff. And it was with a group of women, because it's a group of women who are survivors who are helping other women. And they said, well, we're not the ones who did anything wrong. The people who assaulted us, like, those are the people who should not want their names and their images out there. But we don't feel like we did anything wrong. And in that instance, after going over and over and saying, you know what, this is, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? There are times where I've had to defer to these people because, like, that's what they're saying they want. And for me to say, well, no, you shouldn't do this, or you shouldn't want that up there, is me saying, well, you should be ashamed of this thing, where they're saying, well, no, I'm not. So I think, again, as we've been saying, it goes back to the individual. It goes back to having these conversations. It goes back to explaining the process and explaining, what could happen. So in the case of trolls, yes, if this is something that's online, this is what might happen down the road. But then letting those people make decisions for themselves. And again, I go over these things over and over again. It's not a one-time conversation. I will say, I will check back and check back and check back over the course of interviewing, and then over the course of writing the story. And as I said, there are some instances where I will show people a story before it's published, just to say, okay, this is what I'm doing. Are you okay with this? And then getting their consent.
Yeah, thank you so much. Naseem, would you like to add in quickly?
No, I think Lisa said it great. Just remember, when it comes to trauma-informed journalism and interviewing survivors, informed consent is key. Explain, stay in touch, explain, and as a rule for journalism, go, do not surprise your sources.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. It has been so wonderful to hear from all of you and your expertise. And I appreciate you as a journalist for continuing to normalize this conversation around mental health. I'd like to now bring Catherine Lewis back up.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And yeah, thank you to all the panelists. I learned a lot, and I think so many things that you said are things I've been puzzling over, because I do think some of the norms are shifting, right? The rules we learned about how to do journalism maybe need to evolve with what we know now about survivorship. So thank you so much, Naseem Miller, Amrita Doshi, Lisa Armstrong, and Leslie Rangel, for a really informative and helpful webinar. I also want to mention, it's in the chat, but Leslie does yoga for journalists, and she also is very kindly offering IIJ members a free 20-minute coaching call. So feel free to take advantage of that in the chat. Thank you so much, Leslie. And thanks again to Carly Lanning for suggesting this topic and for helping organize this webinar. And she also has a consultancy where there's information in the chat as well. So definitely a group effort here at the IIJ. And we don't have a webinar next month. Instead, we have a gigantic conference. So please remember to register at the IIJ.com for our 2-day online journalism conference on March 9th and 10th. We are going to have sessions on pitching, fellowships, the business of freelancing, podcasting, interrogating the power and privilege we wield as journalists. And it's a $69 registration fee for 12 live interactive sessions that will be recorded and available until April 10th. And remember, we have scholarships available, so please do not hesitate to put in that form. It's a really short, easy scholarship Google form. So very excited to have that as our March event, and then we'll resume webinars in April. So thank you all so much for being here, the thoughtful questions, the really important guidance that we received from our panelists, and we will see you in March. Take good care.